When my daughter got married, I quietly transferred every dollar I owned into a private trust she knew nothing about. $72 million, built over 40 years of work, locked behind a name she had never heard. My late wife Margaret had always said that money reveals character the way fire reveals gold. You only see what something is truly made of when the heat gets turned up. I thought she was being poetic. I did not realize she was giving me a warning. My name is Robert Callahan. I am 67 years old, a retired architect from Portland, Oregon. For 38 years, I designed buildings, bridges, hospitals, courthouses, structures built to last beyond the men who conceived them. I understand load-bearing walls. I understand the precise point at which a foundation cracks. And I understand, better than most, that the most dangerous collapses are the ones that look perfectly sound from the outside. My daughter Claire was the center of my world after Margaret passed. She was 34, sharp, ambitious, the kind of woman who walked into a room and immediately assessed every exit. I admired that in her. I told myself it was confidence. I told myself it was my own pragmatic nature reflected back at me. I was wrong about what it truly was. She married a man named Derek Shaw 6 months ago. He was a real estate developer, well-dressed, smooth-talking, the kind of man who grips your hand just a fraction too long during a handshake. I stood at the altar in my best suit and watched my daughter become his wife, and I pushed the unease down into my chest where I had learned to store things I did not yet have evidence for. 3 days after they returned from their honeymoon, my doorbell rang at 9 in the morning. I was at my drafting table sketching a greenhouse I had been planning to build in the backyard, something Margaret had always wanted. I set down my pencil, walked to the front door, and opened it. Claire was standing on my porch. She was not alone. Beside her stood a man I had never met, carrying a leather briefcase and wearing the particular expression of someone who has delivered bad news so many times it no longer registers as bad. Behind them, Derek sat in the passenger seat of a black Escalade parked at the curb, his window rolled down, watching without getting out. I smiled. I said, "Honey, this is a surprise." She did not hug me. She said, "Dad, this is Gerald Fitch. He is our family attorney. We need to talk about the house." I looked at Gerald Fitch. He opened his briefcase on my porch railing as casually as if he were setting down a cup of coffee. He pulled out a thick envelope and handed it to me without making eye contact. Inside was a document I recognized immediately, not because I had ever seen one directed at me, but because I had spent a career working alongside attorneys on property transactions. It was a petition for conservatorship. My daughter was filing a legal claim that I was no longer mentally competent to manage my own affairs. She was asking a court to appoint herself as my financial guardian. And attached to it was a document I could not fully process at first, a pre-signed power of attorney, my own signature at the bottom, notarized and dated 2 weeks earlier. I had not signed anything 2 weeks earlier. I had not seen a notary. I had not sat in any attorney's office. On the date printed on that document, I had been 300 miles away in Cannon Beach, helping my old college friend Walter rebuild his back deck after a winter storm. I stood on my own porch holding papers that said I was incompetent and had voluntarily surrendered control of my life, and I felt something I had not felt since the morning Margaret died, a profound, dizzying stillness, as if the ground had decided to become water. "Dad," Claire said, her voice careful and practiced, "we have been worried about you for months. The incident with the stove, the missed appointment with Dr. Hensley. We are not doing this to hurt you. We are doing this because we love you, and we cannot watch you live alone and unsafe anymore." I looked at her. I had not missed an appointment with Dr. Hensley. I had rescheduled one 3 weeks earlier, because my truck needed brake work, and I had not wanted to drive on the highway. I had called the office myself and spoken to the receptionist. That was not a cognitive lapse. That was a Tuesday. And the stove. I knew exactly which incident she meant. Claire and Derek had come for dinner 5 weeks before the wedding. Derek had offered to cook, made a show of it, insisted I relax in the living room. I had smelled something burning 20 minutes later and come into the kitchen to find a dish towel draped over the back burner, the edge beginning to char. Derek had blamed me before I could say a word. He told Claire he had watched me put it there myself and walk away. I had stood in my own kitchen holding a charred dish towel and doubted my memory for 3 full days afterward. I doubted it until right now, standing on my porch with forged paperwork in my hands, because the man who had just sat in my Escalade rather than walk to my door had been in my kitchen that evening, and I suddenly understood with the cold, clarifying precision of a structural analysis exactly what he had done. I folded the documents. I looked at Gerald Fitch. I looked at my daughter. And I did something that surprised all three of us. I smiled. I said, "Thank you for coming, Claire. Give me a few days to review this with my own counsel." She blinked. She had expected tears. She had expected the confused, frightened old man her husband had described to her attorney. Gerald Fitch began to say something about response deadlines. I told him I was familiar with the process. I closed the door. I stood in my foyer for a long moment, listening to the sound of the Escalade pulling away from the curb. Then I walked to my study, sat down at my desk, and began to think with every ounce of the precision I had spent 4 decades sharpening. I did not call the police. Any father who has ever loved his child knows why. Because part of me was still standing at an altar watching her smile, and that version of me needed a moment to finish dying before the architect could take over. I had 3 advantages my daughter did not know about. The first was Walter. He was retired now but had spent 30 years as a federal judge in the Ninth Circuit. He owed me nothing, but he was the most rigorous legal mind I had ever encountered, and he answered on the second ring when I called. The second was a woman named Patricia Osei, the senior administrator of the Caldwell Osei Private Wealth Group, who had managed the family trust for 11 years. She was 48 years old, methodical, and utterly without sentiment when it came to financial crime. I had not spoken to her in 3 months. I called her immediately after Walter. The third was the date on the forged document. I told Patricia everything in a single phone call. She did not interrupt once. When I finished, she said, "Robert, I want you to listen to me carefully. This is not the first time we have seen a conservatorship petition filed against a trust beneficiary by a family member with access to their personal documents. It is a known strategy. It is particularly common when the family member has reason to believe there is a large estate at stake." I said, "She does not know about the trust, Patricia." There was a brief silence. She said, "Are you certain of that?" I said, "I have never told a living soul except you and the trust attorneys." She said, "Then someone has been speculating, and speculating hard enough to commit a federal crime. I need you to do nothing visible for the next 48 hours. Do not contest the document. Do not call Claire. Do not retain a local attorney who might trigger a court filing that alerts them. Let me work quietly first." I said, "What are you looking for?" She said, "I want to know why they need this now. People do not file fraudulent conservatorship papers for sport, Robert. Something is driving this timeline. I spent those 48 hours doing exactly what Claire expected of me. I moved slowly around the house. I drove to the grocery store and back. I let my neighbor Donna see me in the garden, pulling weeds, unhurried, unremarkable. I was a retired man, living a quiet life. I was absolutely nothing to worry about. What I was actually doing was remembering every interaction with Derek Shaw over the past 18 months, laying them out in sequence the way I used to lay out blueprints every visit, every question he had asked about the house, every time he had steered a dinner conversation toward my retirement income, my pension, what Margaret had left behind. There had been more of those conversations than I had registered in real time. He had been building a picture of my finances with the patient, methodical approach of a man who knew exactly what he was looking for. He had simply looked in the wrong places. Patricia called me on the evening of the second day. She told me to sit down, and I did. She had deployed 2 forensic accountants and a private investigator. What they had found in 48 hours was this. Derek Shaw's development company, Shaw Pacific Properties, had borrowed $11 million from a private equity firm called Meridian Capital Group 18 months ago, right around the time he began dating my daughter. The loan was secured against 2 commercial projects in Bend and Medford that had since collapsed in a regional market correction. Meridian had been patient for a while, but 4 weeks ago they had issued a formal demand letter. Derek had 30 days to produce proof of liquid assets sufficient to cover the defaulted loan, or Meridian would initiate a seizure of every personal asset he held, including his interest in the house he and Claire had purchased together. Patricia paused. Then she said, "Robert, there is more." I told her to continue. 6 weeks ago, Derek retained a specialty insurance broker and took out a $2 million life insurance policy. The insured party was not himself. It was you. He had used the pre-signed power of attorney, the same forged document served to you on your porch, to authorize it. The policy contained a standard clause. Full payout upon natural death in a supervised care facility. I sat with that for a moment. The whole architecture of it spread out in my mind like a floor plan. The manufactured incidents, the charred dish towel, the rescheduled appointment, the conservatorship petition, which would give Claire legal authority over my assets and allow her to place me in a facility of her choosing. The life insurance policy, which would pay out $2 million when I died in that facility. And somewhere underneath all of it, Derek Shaw drowning in $11 million of debt with a 30-day deadline. My daughter had not built this. She was not capable of building this. But she had let someone build it around her, and at some point she had stopped asking questions. That was its own kind of choice. I told Patricia I needed one more thing. I needed her to find out what facility they had selected. She called back 2 hours later. It was a place in rural Washington, 60 miles from the Oregon border. It was licensed barely, and recently, but the license had been expedited through a county office where Derek had made a campaign contribution 3 years prior. The facility had 2 physicians on staff. Both had received consulting fees from a Delaware LLC that Patricia traced back to a holding company Derek controlled. I set the phone down. I walked to the window and looked out at the backyard, at the patch of ground where I had been planning to build Margaret's greenhouse. The evening light was the particular shade of amber that she had called painter's light. She used to stand at this very window and watch it. I thought about what she would have said if she were standing beside me right now. She would have said, "Robert, stop grieving and start building. You know how to build things that last." She was right. She was always right. I called Patricia back and said, "I need you to find out who holds Derek's Meridian Capital debt." She said she already knew. I said, "I need you to buy it." She was quiet for 3 seconds. Then she said, "You want to purchase his loan?" I said, "I want to own every dollar he owes. I want Meridian out of the picture, and I want the full debt obligation transferred to a holding entity I control, anonymously. I want it done before the weekend," she said. "For a full cash buyout, Meridian will move immediately. They want liquidity, not a protracted collection battle. But Robert, once you own the note, you become his creditor. You will have direct legal authority to trigger default proceedings and initiate asset seizure." I said, "I know. That is the point." She said, "That is $11 million. I said, "Patricia, I have 72 of them. Do it." She did it in 26 hours. Meridian Capital accepted the buyout on a Friday morning and signed the debt transfer documents that afternoon. By Friday evening, Derek Shaw owed $11 million to a private holding company called Cascadia Asset Management, a company that existed, legally and entirely, for the purpose of collecting this specific debt, and that I controlled through 3 layers of corporate structure that would take his attorneys weeks to untangle. He had no idea. As far as Derek knew, the world had shifted in his favor. Meridian had gone quiet. The deadline pressure had eased. He had no reason to believe that the invisible hand that had relieved his immediate crisis was his father-in-law. On Saturday morning, Claire called me. Her voice was softer than it had been on the porch. She asked how I was doing. She asked if I had spoken to an attorney. I told her I had been resting, that the whole thing had been a lot to take in, that I thought maybe she was right, that I needed more support. I let my voice carry just enough tremor to satisfy whatever picture she had built of me in her mind. She told me she was glad I was being reasonable. She told me she would come by next week and we could talk. I told her I was looking forward to it. That same afternoon I drove to Walter's house in Astoria. He had already drafted the legal response to the conservatorship petition. He had also done something I had not asked him to do. He had contacted a former colleague at the U.S. Attorney's office in Portland and described the situation in general terms. His former colleague had expressed significant interest: federal wire fraud, elder financial abuse, insurance fraud, forgery of a notarized legal document. These were not misdemeanor concerns. Walter walked me through the package he had assembled. He had affidavits from the notary registry confirming that the notary whose seal appeared on my power of attorney had been on medical leave in Arizona on the date of the alleged signing. He had a certified statement from Walter confirming my presence in Cannon Beach on that same date, corroborated by a hardware store receipt, 3 photographs with GPS metadata, and a text message chain with the lumber yard. He had Patricia's forensic documentation of the insurance policy, the debt structure, and the corporate trail linking Derek to the care facility's licensing. He set it all in a single manila folder and slid it across the kitchen table. He said, "Robert, this is complete. This is ironclad. You can hand this to federal prosecutors today. I picked up the folder. I held it. I said, "Not yet, Walter." He looked at me for a long moment. Then he said, "You want them to come to you." I said, "I want them to walk all the way in before I close the door." He nodded slowly. He poured us both a cup of coffee. He said, "What is the timeline?" I said, "Claire is coming next week. I expect she will want to discuss the facility. I expect Derek will push her to accelerate the conservatorship timeline. When she comes, she will be walking into my house believing she is managing a confused old man's transition into care. I need her to walk in far enough that when the door closes, there is no exit." Walter looked at me over his coffee cup. He said, "You know this is going to end your relationship with her." I said, "Walter, she selected a facility 60 miles from the Oregon border that charges consulting fees through my son-in-law's shell company. She did not select a relationship, she selected an outcome." He was quiet. He understood. The week moved slowly. I went about my life with the careful, unremarkable routine of a man who had accepted his limitations. I weeded the garden. I drove to the hardware store. I sketched the greenhouse in the evenings and let myself believe, just for a few hours each night, that I would still build it. I called my old friend Raymond in Tucson and talked about nothing important for 45 minutes. I cooked good meals and ate them at the table the way Margaret had always insisted, not standing over the sink. On Thursday evening, Patricia sent me a message. Derek had called Meridian Capital that morning to check on an administrative detail. The number had been disconnected. He had called their main office line. The receptionist had informed him that the account had been sold to a third-party investor. Derek had asked who. She had given him the name Cascadia Asset Management. Patricia said her source at his brokerage confirmed he had spent 2 hours that afternoon trying to identify who owned Cascadia and had found nothing. Good. Let him spend the weekend in that particular darkness. Let him feel the ground shift without knowing why. Claire arrived on Tuesday at 10 in the morning. She was alone. That surprised me. I had expected Derek. She looked tired in a way that people look when they have been carrying something they did not fully understand when they agreed to carry it. I made coffee. I set out the good cups, the ones with the blue rim that had been Margaret's mother's. Claire wrapped both hands around hers the way she had done since she was small. She said, "Dad, Gerald Fitch needs a response to the petition by Friday." She said it quietly, almost apologetically, looking at the table. She said, "I know this is hard. I know this is not how either of us wanted things to go." I said, "Claire, who suggested the facility in Washington?" She looked up. She said, "Derek found it. He researched a lot of options." I said, "Did you research it yourself?" A pause. She said, "He showed me the website. It looked beautiful." I said, "Did you know that 2 of the physicians on staff receive consulting fees from a company Derek owns?" The color did not drain from her face. It did something slower and more permanent. It settled, like a building shifting on a weak foundation, not collapsing yet but no longer level. She said, "What are you talking about?" I placed a folder on the table between us. I did not open it. I just set it there. I said, "Claire, I need you to understand something before anyone else comes through that door. I am not confused. I am not declining. I did not sign those documents. On the day that notary seal was stamped, I was in Cannon Beach with Walter, and there are 17 forms of documentation that confirm it." I said, "I also need you to know that the man you married is $11 million in debt to a private equity firm, and that firm's debt was purchased 3 days ago by an entity I control." I said, "I have been your father for 34 years. I am asking you, right now, as your father, to look at the documents in that folder before you make any more decisions." She opened the folder with hands that were not entirely steady. She read for a long time. I sat across from her and drank my coffee and let her read. The kitchen was quiet except for the sound of paper turning and, somewhere outside, a neighbor's lawnmower. When she reached the page that documented the life insurance policy, she stopped. She did not turn the page for a very long time. She sat with it the way you sit with something that has changed the shape of the room around you. She said, "Derek took this out." I said, "Yes." She said, "It pays out what he churs affiliate." I said, "Yes." She put the papers down on the table. She pressed both hands flat against the surface as if she needed to feel something solid. She said, "Dad, I didn't know about this. I didn't know about any of this. I looked at my daughter. I have known her since before she could walk. I know the difference between her lying face and her broken face. She was not lying. I said, I know you didn't design this, Claire, but you let someone hand you paperwork and tell you it was love, and you signed it without reading it carefully enough, and that matters too. She put her face in her hands. She stayed there for a while. I did not reach across the table. Some moments need to be held, not smoothed over. After a time, she looked up and said, What do I do? I said, You are going to do exactly what I tell you. What happened next was not fast, and it was not clean, but it was complete. Claire cooperated fully. She provided Walter's contact with every document Derek had given her, every conversation she could remember, every financial instruction he had quietly folded into their marriage over the past 18 months. She had not known about the Meridian debt. She had not known about the insurance policy. She had known, I think, that something was wrong, but she had looked away from it in the particular way that people look away from things they are not ready to name. Gerald Fitch, when he discovered the scope of what he had facilitated, retained his own criminal defense attorney within 48 hours. He cooperated with federal investigators thoroughly and without the dignity of someone who had ever considered the possibility that dignity might one day matter. Derek Shaw spent 3 weeks insisting through his attorney that the forged documents had been prepared without his knowledge. The forensic accounting trail, the corporate structure linking him to the care facility, the insurance broker's testimony, and 3 months of his own email correspondence dismantled that position entirely. The U.S. attorney filed charges on a Friday morning: wire fraud, elder financial abuse, insurance fraud, conspiracy to commit forgery. He was taken into custody at the development office he could no longer afford to keep the lights on in. On the morning Derek was arraigned, I was in my backyard. The air was cool and smelled like cedar and turned earth. I had broken ground on the greenhouse 2 days earlier, nothing yet except a cleared rectangle of soil and 4 corner stakes with string running between them. Margaret's greenhouse. 17 years late. I stood at the edge of that rectangle and looked at what it would become. A small glass structure, south-facing, room for tomatoes and herbs, and the particular kind of silence that only exists when you are tending something alive. Sons and daughters who are reading this, if you have elderly parents and you believe their age has made them vulnerable, you are probably right that the world sees them that way. But I want you to understand something that took me 67 years and a forged notary seal to say clearly. Patience is not the same as blindness. Silence is not the same as surrender. And the men and women who built the world you inherited have been solving structural problems since before you knew what a problem was. My daughter called me that evening. We talked for a long time. Some of it was hard. Most of it was honest. Honesty, I have found, is the only material that holds weight over time more than money, more than property, more than the signatures we leave on things. If this story stayed with you, I hope you will share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you have faced something like this yourself, if someone you loved underestimated you and learned the cost of it, tell me where you are watching from in the comments. I read every single one. Be well, and take care of each other. No matter how many times life knocks you sideways, the steadiest thing you can carry is the quiet confidence of knowing who you are. Robert never shouted, never panicked, never stopped being a father, even when fatherhood broke his heart. And that discipline, that refusal to let grief become recklessness, is what saved him. Tend your own foundation carefully, friends. The people who underestimate you are counting on you to forget how strong it is. A small note for you: this story was created and fictionalized by AI, crafted to bring you a moment of entertainment while leaving behind something worth keeping. The reminder that patience and integrity are never wasted, even when no one is watching.